In the morning of September 17th, the Germans took the village of Novaki and bypassed the defence of the regiment from three sides, recalled the last battle F. I. Wróblewski. I. Wróblewski. We were cut off from our rear, which together with my deputy Major Kozodov were in the village of Kitsy. Border guards had nowhere to replenish ammunition. We lacked water. The only well on Vasilenkovo field the Germans kept under fire. The attack on the regiment's positions the enemy started again from the monastery. Tanks took on their armour troop of machine gunners, and dozens of vehicles came at us from three sides. We could not prevent their approach to the trenches. German sappers made passages through the anti-tank ditch. Border guards had to fight back with bottles with a flammable mixture. Chad and smoke stood in a dense veil near our trenches. The battle unfolded on a multi-kilometre stretch, so it is difficult to fully restore the whole picture of the battle that took place near Lubny. But even today, remembering that day, I, as a former commander of the regiment, can proudly say that the soldiers and commanders showed mass heroism, showed such fearlessness and courage, which only a Soviet man could show in that situation. I remember how three border guards, when an enemy tank passed through their trench, climbed up on it and started shooting through the observation slits. They had nothing to set the tank on fire, so they shot into the slits with their rifles. The tank drove them on its armour for a long time. This is one of many episodes I witnessed personally. There were fewer and fewer of us left. Under the onslaught of the enemy, the area defended by the regiment narrowed more and more. The soldiers were still holding back the Nazis, but the last forces were leaving. Wróblewski understood well the border guards had done almost impossible, but it was senseless to stay on the height. It meant to give the remaining people to the enemy. The soldiers and commanders of the regiment could not do more. They already for 3 days chained to themselves a whole enemy compound. There remained a narrow strip of land not occupied by the enemy, through which it was possible to withdraw to the Lubny forest. It is only necessary to break away from the fascist tanks and machine gunners. And for this it is necessary at least part of the forces to counterattack the enemy, to divert his attention. All well imagined the fate of counterattack groups, but there was no choice. The counterattackers were led by the Chief of Staff of the regiment, Major Dainigo, and the military commissar of the regiment, Battalion Commissar Avdyukin. The last day near Lubny recalls another of the participants of the battle border guard, Gerasim Kostyukov. For the border guards of the detachment was hard. We had almost nothing to beat the Germans with, but they were climbing and climbing. Our outpost, among other units, was ordered to counterattack the Germans, and thus give the opportunity to get out from under fire the main forces of the regiment. Before the counterattack began, several commanders from headquarters appeared in the trench. Among them were Major Dainigo and a captain, a Georgian by nationality. In front of our section was a deep ravine and anti-tank ditch, and Nazi tanks bypassed us. But German machine gunners advanced almost to the trenches. At the command we jumped out of the trenches and ran down the slope of the height with bayonets drawn. Hitlerites did not expect this and retreated. In the order of NKVD of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic from September 25th, 1941, it is said, in view of heavy losses from this date, 94th Border Detachment ceased to exist. Yes, so ceased to exist in September 1941 as an independent combat unit, our frontier detachment. But this was not the end of its combat path and combat history. The 92nd Border Guard Regiment was formed from the survivors of our detachment. Major F. I. Wróblewski was appointed its commander, Battalion Commissar N. A. Avdyukin was appointed its commissar, Major M.K. Kudryashov was appointed its chief of staff. Battalion commanders were also soldiers of the 94th Border Troops, Capt. V. Burtsev and Captain Alaska Tatyanin. With several soldiers of my outpost, I was also waiting for the appointment. We lived in one of the schools in Belgorod. It was a large 3-story building located in the center of the city. For a few days that we spent here, after leaving the encirclement, we were changed into new uniforms, fed. We were replenished with ammunition. We slept in the classrooms on the floor, putting a duffel bag under our heads and covering ourselves with overcoats. There was a canteen in the school. 2 or 3 times I went for lunch to the city canteen, which was nearby, a few blocks from us. One day I met Commissar Bogotikov there. "I don't recognize you," Bogotikov said. looking me over. "Well, how are you?" I explained that I was waiting for an assignment. "Let's join me in the 21st Army," he suggested. I shook my head. "No, I'm a border guard and I'm not going anywhere from my regiment." That was the last meeting with Ivan Nikiforovich, deputy head of the political department of the 21st Army. Since then our paths have not crossed. After the war, one found out that he died at the end of 1942 near Stalingrad. 2 of his sons live in Moscow. Several times in those days I happened to walk along the streets of Belgorod. The city was evacuated, but everything was calm. There was no fuss or panic. Normal trade was going on in the stores. The power station was working. In the city, loudspeakers rattled marches. There was a radio station in our school. We listened to the latest news, discussed the situation at the front. There was a lull in our section, and that was encouraging. There was talk that perhaps soon a counteroffensive would begin. At the end of September, I was finally summoned to the regimental headquarters. I went there, as they say, in full combat readiness with a weapon, a tablet, in a warm jacket, with a flask on my belt. "How are you feeling?" asked Wroblewski. "Everything is fine. I'm tired of lying down." "How many with you came out of the encirclement?" 7, I answered. "Here's your instructions. Take your men with you. You're going to the 1st Battalion to Captain Tatyanin." Leaving the regiment commander, I went into the room where my subordinates, border guards Makarov, Yerdakov, Volkov, Kolesnikov and others were waiting for me. "Well, boys," I said, "get ready. Let's go." The soldiers quickly put on overcoats, took their rifles, threw their cartridges over their shoulders, hooked their pouches and grenades to their belts, and left the school after me. On the way out of the city in the Mikoyanovka area, there was a small factory where one of the companies of our battalion was stationed. We found Lieutenant Gavrikov, the commander, and clarified how to get to the village of Tomarovka, where the battalion headquarters was located. It was a fine autumn morning. There was not a cloud in the sky. A small grove, which met on the way, stood quietly in a delicate golden decoration. No cars or military equipment could be seen on the road. Only occasionally there were wagons on which collective farmers were carrying potatoes, grain, or were travelling on them for some other purpose. From time to time larks flew up from the roadside. The sight of carefree birds brought peaceful, calm thoughts. We walked briskly along the harvested fields, rejoicing that at last we would be in business again, that our frontier detachment, only renamed into a frontier regiment, continued to exist, that in general, though the Germans had squeezed us out, but their blitzkrieg plans, despite the seemingly significant first successes, had failed. It was long past August, the last month of the war, according to Hitler's forecasts, but neither Moscow nor Leningrad had fallen. The battles were becoming disadvantageous for the German invaders, protracted character. For 2 months Odessa was defended. The enemy unsuccessfully stormed the Crimean Isthmus. For a month and a half he could not break through in Luga direction. He was stopped in the far north, on the rivers Svir and Volkhov. It was felt the pressure of Hitler's troops was weakening. The enemy was clearly exhausted, though it was still strong. By evening we stopped in one of villages on the way to Tomarovo. In the house where lived a lonely old man and an old woman, we settled down for the night. It turned out that they had 2 sons at the front and a daughter, and no letters. Anyway, we got to talking. We told them how we'd come from the border, what battles we'd fought in. "And we survived," Falcons, the old woman lamented. "Maybe ours are alive too." The old man took out some photos. "Look, Commander, have not met where these—" I looked at the photos and shook my head. In the morning we continued on our way, and in the afternoon we came to Tomarovka. At the entrance to the village we were met by patrolling border guards and meticulously checked everyone's documents. It was a pleasure to observe this. There was no carelessness. Everything was strict, frontline style, borderline style. There was a sentry at the battalion headquarters. Again I had to take out and show my ID card and prescription. I saw Captain Tatyanin for the first time. When I entered the house, he was discussing something with other staff workers. After reading the order, the commander squinted his eyes and, smiling slyly, remarked, "Apparently there was a misunderstanding. I have all the company commanders are. But after all." I pointed to the prescription. The battalion commander once again reread the paper and shrugged his shoulders. Something they mixed up there, and suddenly said, "But I could use a platoon commander. The first company lacks one platoon." I stood, thinking about the situation that had suddenly created. Of course, not very happy about the prospect of getting instead of a company platoon. After all, I was the head of the outpost, which, if you translate it into army ranks, the company commander. Besides, I had participated in battles. Apparently, that's what the regimental headquarters based their recommendation on. But there was some kind of a misunderstanding. What to do now? Not to argue with Captain Tatyanin, who had nothing to do with it, and not to walk back 50 versts to the regimental headquarters. A platoon is a platoon. And waving my hand, I told the commander half jokingly, half seriously, "It does not matter what rank to be in, as long as to beat the Germans." Tatyanin smiled and told me to find Junior Lieutenant Vasily Gorbanov and report to him that I was at his disposal. He was the commander of the 1st Company. We knew Vasily Gorbanov from our joint service first in the 20th Slavuta and then in the 94th Smolensk Border Guard detachments. He was born in Kuibyshev and worked as a school teacher before being drafted into the border troops. Just before the war, he finished a 3-month course for junior lieutenants and soon became the head of an outpost. Now, in the course of combat operations, he was promoted to company commander. I introduced myself to Gorbunov, but he waved his hand. What formalities are there? Almost immediately, he admitted that it was difficult for him to command the company and manage operational and service activities, and asked me to help him. We worked amicably. Gorbunov was a combat commander, energetic, courageous, and this to some extent compensated for the lack of knowledge and experience. The political commander in the company was Senior Political Commander Lavrenov, a calm, balanced man who had served earlier in the 20th Slavuta Border Detachment as a secretary of the party bureau, and then in the 94th as a political commander of one of the outposts. We also knew him. In the first battles, Lavrenov showed himself with the best side, showed courage and bravery. And the deputy commander of the company was also our comrade in arms, a man of great savvy and bogatyr strength, Lieutenant Ilya Vasilchenko, who was in the 94th Border Guard Detachment Assistant Chief of the operational post. He was also in the battles near Popelnya, Elisavetovka and Lubny. The platoon commanders were unfamiliar to me. Lieutenant Osaulov was drafted from the reserve, and Lieutenant Ryatsev had previously served in the internal troops of the NKVD. I was very glad that my subordinates, border guards of the 10th Outpost, other soldiers of our and neighbouring border guard units, who had passed, as they say, through fire and water, continued to be with me in the platoon. My assistant in the platoon was Konstantin Tilian, a former foreman of one of the outposts of the 92nd Paramishal Detachment, who fought in Paramishal under the Horns, and more than once went up to counterattack the enemy. Makarov, Kolesnikov, Volkov, Yerdakov were enrolled in the platoon. I knew these people well, experienced them in battle, believed in them without limits. I believed in their fearlessness, exceptional discipline, readiness to fulfill any order. After all this time they performed the most difficult tasks, and in a new environment you could rely on them. And in other units of the regiment continued to serve former border guards of the 10th, Outpost Petty Officer Mikhail Vashinin, Sergeant Vasily Borisov, Peter Dmitriev and others, never once had to blush for them. All of them selflessly fulfilled the duties assigned to them, showed selfless devotion to the cause, and when a difficult hour came, fought to the death with the enemy and died as heroes. At the end of September, the situation at the front continued to be tense. Literally soon after we were in Tomarovo, it became known about a new Hitlerite offensive undertaken on Moscow. It began on September 30th, 1941. The enemy sought at any cost to encircle and destroy our troops covering the capital. On October 3rd, 1941, in a speech on the radio, Hitler said 48 hours ago began operations of gigantic proportions. They will contribute to the destruction of the enemy in the east. The enemy has already been defeated and will never regain his strength again. This boastful statement took into account neither the capabilities of our state nor those of the Red Army, which, in spite of losses, did its job courageously and steadfastly. We found ourselves on the sidelines of the main blow of the Nazi troops. After the formation of the 92nd Frontier Regiment entered the newly created Southwestern Front. In early October, the Germans in the area to Marivka Grun, which was covered by the 9th Cavalry Division and its rear lines our battalion, were quiet. This respite fighters and commanders of the division used to improve the defence. They had already had to be in battle. It was this cavalry division provided a way out of the encirclement of our troops in the area of Sorochintsev and Savintsev. It acted at Konevsky crossings on the Dnieper, distinguished itself in other battles. Usually to search for saboteurs, spies, agents, a squad was sent with me or my platoon commander. We combed the terrain, searched forests and groves, ravines and hollows, went into villages. We followed a certain route, planned in the battalion headquarters or by the company commander. We slept in barns. Empty houses, there were many of them. People were evacuated, went to the rear of the country. While everything was quiet, we used the telephone and radio network of civilian communication centres. With the help of this network, companies and platoons kept in touch with their headquarters when performing combat tasks. Through these channels we listened to the voice of the capital of our motherland, Moscow, which instilled in our hearts confidence in the power of our country, the invincibility of the Red Army. Everyone waited impatiently for the latest news. Every new message about what was happening near Moscow was immediately brought by political workers to the soldiers. They immediately took out a geographical map with mobile red paper flags, marked the front line. We, who were the first to take the terrible force of the enemy's blow, saw well, though the enemy was pushing our troops, but was getting weaker every day. However, the enemy still had sufficient forces to fight not only near Moscow, but also in other places of the huge Soviet-German front. At the end of October, the Hitlerites pushed the Soviet troops and in our area, parts of the 21st Army, the rear of which we were guarding, conducting heavy bloody battles, also withdrew and consolidated to the west of Belgorod. The weather was cold and rainy. The roads were swollen. The 9th Cavalry Division was moving to a new defensive line. Interacting with it, covering its rear guards, we also withdrew. We walked through fields and woods. Softened black earth stuck to the boots. The horses barely dragged their feet on this liquefied earth. One evening our company found itself in the village of Sabanin. We were struck by the colour of the water in the Seversky Donets. It was a kind of greyish-white. Only after looking closely we saw flocks of ducks and geese on the river, and then we heard their mighty cry. Someone asked political officer Lavrenov where so many birds were coming from in such a small village. Apparently it's what the collective farms are evacuating, the senior political officer suggested, and with a few soldiers started to go down to the river. And so it turned out to be. Poultry farms from many evacuated collective farms were concentrated in Sabanin. Collective farmers were stealing poultry from the enemy. As soon as we were in the village, the company commander ordered me to look for representatives of the local authorities. Taking with me the squad commander Sergeant Kishinevsky, I went to the board of the collective farm. It was located in a small house on the central square. When we went there, we saw many people discussing something animatedly. "Hello, where can I find the chairman of the collective farm or village council?" I asked. The man sitting at the table answered, "I am the chairman of the collective farm, and here he is." The man pointed at his neighbour, the chairman of the village council. I came closer. "Ah, the border guards are here, so tomorrow the Germans will be here," said a short man sitting next to the chairman. "Well, it is not necessary," I tried to object. But the man smiled good-naturedly and continued. "Don't take offence, believe me, I know. I come from almost the border. So it is not the first time I meet with border guards. There is no one behind you. Yesterday afternoon the cavalry rode through the village and went beyond Seversky Donets. Today you've come, so tomorrow we'll wait for the Germans." There was truth in the stranger's words. Border guards, as a rule, were the last to leave. This was seen by the inhabitants of many towns and villages, heads of party and state bodies. Apparently, the man who spoke to me was from the western parts of the country. That's why he perceived our appearance in such a way. As if summarizing our conversation, I said, "Comrades, chairman of the collective farm and village council, you are requested to come up by our command." Company Commander Gorbinov and political officer Lavrinov informed the local leaders of the actual situation and advised to evacuate everything that could be evacuated beyond Seversky Donets. "We have a lot of fish in the stakes. What to do with it?" asked the chairman of the collective farm. "At night drain the water, and in the morning distribute everything to the collective farmers," recommended political officer Lavrinov. At dawn the company left the village. On the steep western bank we went down to the river, and then someone asked in surprise, "Comrades, where has the river gone?" Instead of wide shoulders, which were here yesterday, reeds and sedges rustled under our feet. Only a little ahead, among a set of small square pits, like a thread, a stream no more than 1/2 meter wide was winding. Somewhere on the muddy-bottom golden carp were jumping in dark puddles. This was all that was left of the collective farm's fishery. Politruk Lavrinov explained to the border guards what had happened, and then, turning to the company commander, said, "Aye, and the chairman well done. He left neither birds nor fish for the Germans." "Yes, he worked hard," said Lieutenant Gorbinov, "so hard that we didn't hear. Really well done." "What is Hitler counting on?" Lavrinov said suddenly. "How can he break such a people?" And answered himself, "No, he can't." The company commander nodded his head in agreement. We crossed the shoal Donets and entered the broken, swollen from the rain, which was still falling, field road. In 2 hours it was lost among the fields, and then it ended at blackened straw stacks. Further on we went along the field. The soaked black earth was so sticky to the feet that it seemed that lead plates were suspended from the boots. Soaked to the last thread and exhausted, we spent the night in some village. By the end of the next day the company reached the Korocha River. However, even here we did not stay long. The order came to withdraw to the Oskol River. Somewhere ahead of us followed 2 companies and the headquarters of our battalion. More and more often on our way met freshly dug trenches, anti-tank ditches, in many places half flooded with water. It was felt that everything was prepared for defence, but apparently in the current situation to occupy this line was unprofitable. Our regiment again went out to protect the rear of the 21st Army. This army was formed in April 1941 in the Volga military district. A week before the treacherous attack of Hitler's Germany on the Soviet Union, its troops began to redeploy to the territory of the Western Special Military District. The war caught most of the compounds in echelons, stretching along the railroads from the Volga to the Dnieper. On July 1, 1941, the army deployed along the Dnieper from Mogilev to Rychitsa, and on July 13 began the offensive in the direction of Bobruisk. Hitler's General A. Philippi in the book Pripyat Problem wrote the right wing of Army Group Center lagged behind. It was still in mid-July delayed at the border Krychov-Rogachev, not being able to break the increasing resistance of the 21st Army of the Russians north of Gomel. Now the 21st Army was gaining a foothold on the banks of the Seversky Donets. The battalion headquarters and our company settled in the district center Chernyanka, Kursk region. It was a large urban-type settlement with 1-story wooden houses. In it were located the leadership of Chernyanka district, 2 collective farm boards and 2 village councils. The days of the celebration of the 24th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution were approaching. Residents of Chernyanka were preparing to meet the holiday. They tidied up their houses, whitewashed them, swept yards and streets. For us these days were filled with cares. Just now the battalion headquarters received information that a group of suspicious people appeared in the village of Nilushi. Our platoon was raised on alert. We rushed to the village. We questioned the locals, talked to the chairman of the collective farm. All of them said yes, they were there, they took the food and left, but no one knows where they went. For 4 days we travelled around the area until finally we came upon the trail of this group. The saboteurs shot back, but in the end they were forced to surrender. We returned to Chernyanka on November 6th in the afternoon. On many houses hung red flags, and in the centre of town, in the square, slogans were visible. The soldiers and company commanders were stationed in the building of one of the schools. There we also stayed. With impatience, everyone was looking forward to the evening. The eyes of the border guards were fixed on the wall, where a bulky black loudspeaker hung. The local radio station was about to start broadcasting. Would Moscow say something? Finally, there was a slight crackle in the loudspeaker, and then the announcer's voice announced, "Attention, Moscow is speaking." Everyone held their breath. The solemn meeting of the Moscow Council of Workers' Deputies with the party and public organizations of Moscow was beginning. A few more moments, and from the speaker came a familiar muffled voice. Stamping every word, Stalin spoke about the results of the first 4 months of the war, the failure of Hitler's plan for a lightning victory, the reasons for the temporary military failures of the Red Army, the tasks facing the army and the Soviet people. "The German invaders want to have an extermination war with the peoples of the USSR, said Stalin. Well, if the Germans want to have an extermination war, they will get it. Unlike Hitler's Germany, the Soviet Union and its allies are waging a war of liberation, just designed to liberate the enslaved peoples of Europe and the USSR from Hitler's tyranny. But in order to realize these goals, it is necessary to crush the military power of the German invaders. It is necessary that our army and our navy have the active support of our entire country, that our entire country and all the peoples of the USSR organize themselves into a single fighting camp, waging together with our army and navy a great liberation war for the honor and freedom of our motherland, for the defeat of the German armies. That is the task now. We can and we must fulfill this task." Stalin ended his report with the words, "Our cause is right, victory will be ours." We applauded, shouted hurrah, felt as if we were there, at a solemn meeting in Moscow. The whole evening we were impressed by the speech we had heard. And someone dropped a thought out loud, which was then discussed for a long time among the soldiers and commanders: would there be a traditional parade of troops on Red Square tomorrow? The majority agreed that due to the exceptional nature of the situation near Moscow, there would be no parade. There was no time for parades, they said. Now we had to beat the Germans. What was our surprise in the morning, when we heard the amazing news the parade of troops on Red Square took place. In full combat readiness, units and subdivisions were passing through Red Square past Lenin's mausoleum to go straight to the front. We heard on the loudspeaker, where everyone was gathered again, the measured march of regiments, the mighty roar of tank engines, and listened to what was happening in our native Moscow as a harbinger of the coming victories. In Chernyanka, a rally was also held on the square, at which a representative of the district party committee and someone from the collective farmers made a speech. All the soldiers of our battalion who were free from service also gathered at the rally. On the podium stood Captain Tutyanin. Our mood was festive, elevated. For a long time that day on the central square of Chernyanka music was playing. In the first days of November, the enemy offensive near Moscow was stopped almost in all directions, which forced Hitlerites to pull up reserves again and prepare a new rush to the capital of our motherland. It began in the middle of November and lasted until the first days of December. It became finally obvious hopelessness of all attempts of the enemy to seize the Soviet capital. The offensive in the Moscow direction crashed against the impregnable steadfastness of the Soviet soldiers. The enemy suffered huge losses. Parts of the 21st Army on the banks of the Seversky Donets stopped the enemy offensive. The front in this area stabilized. December 1st, 1941, the commander of the 21st Army, Lieutenant General V.N. Gordov, ordered the commander of the 92nd Border Regiment, Major F.I. Wroblewski, to form a fighter detachment from the soldiers and commanders of the regiment to act behind enemy lines. Captain Tutyanin was appointed commander of this detachment. Senior political officer Tarasenkov was appointed military commander. The detachment consisted of 116 people. There were 11 communists and 71 Komsomol members. Partagom detachment appointed Junior Sergeant Slychakova. In each platoon there was a Komsomol organizer. Senior Lieutenant Chashkin, Lieutenant Fomenko and Lieutenant Gorbunov became platoon commanders. From our platoon, 2 border guards went to the Extermination Squadron machine gunner Pyatunin and his second number. On December 4th, 1941, at 4 o'clock, the detachment left by automobile to the town of Korocha, where the headquarters of the 21st Army was stationed. At 18 o'clock, the task from the commander was received to pass unnoticed to the rear of the enemy, to Kislovsky Forest near the village Gostashiva, and to arrange an ambush on probable ways of movement of German troops. The term of the operation was 3 days. It was 30-degree frost. A blizzard was blowing. So that machine guns and machine guns did not fail in battle in such cold, the soldiers filled flasks with alcohol to wash the bolts and moving parts of machine guns. During the night, a thick snow fell. The fighter detachment safely crossed the front line and reached the Kislovsky Forest, where the platoon entrenched on the edge of the snow. One of the reports of the regiment commander says at 14.30, a small group of Red Army fighters and commanders appeared from the village of Gostishevo, coming out of the encirclement. This group with a fight withdrew to the forest. They were where there was a detachment of border guards. A handful of fighters numbering 20 people was pursued by about 2 battalions of Germans. The enemy pinned them to the forest and then surrounded them. The Germans were sure that only these fighters were in the forest. The Hitlerites did not suspect that a fighter detachment was concentrated here. When they considered the encirclement of the retreating Red Army soldiers to be finished, one of the German officers, approaching the forest, shouted, "Russ, surrender. You are surrounded. Commissars and communists, come forward and to the right, the rest to the left." With the first shot, the hapless fascist orator was killed. The fighter detachment, occupying a circular defence, steadfastly repelled 6 attacks made by the enemy. Each time the frontier guards met the enemy with friendly fire. All attempts of Hitlerites to squeeze the encirclement ring and to destroy the fighters who were in it failed. The personnel of the fighter squad fought bravely and skillfully. And then Captain Tatyanin and senior political officer Tarasenkov raised the fighters in the attack. The enemy ring was broken through. The enemy fled in panic. More than 200 killed and wounded fascists were left on the battlefield. The fighter squad lost 5 fighters, 4 were wounded. All the wounded were evacuated and sent to the hospital. I learned about all this from my subordinate Pyatunin, who had safely returned to the platoon. Finding me, he reported that he had arrived after a special mission behind enemy lines. I asked Pyatunin to tell about the actions of the fighter squad to the whole platoon. The soldiers listened to him with interest and expressed a wish to go to the enemy rear next time as part of the fighter squad. The commander of the 21st Army gave a high assessment of the actions of the border guards. He ordered to present all participants of the battle to the award. Machine gunner Pyatunin and his second number were awarded. At the end of December, all those presented for the award were summoned to the regimental headquarters. From Korocha, 2 of our border guards returned with medals for bravery. In early December, we learned about the counter-offensive near Moscow, and by the middle of the month about its first results. The troops of the Kalinin, Bryansk, Western and Southwestern fronts successfully carried out the first major offensive operation in the course of the Great Patriotic War, which had strategic importance and historical consequences. As a result of persistent battles, the Soviet troops liberated from the German fascist invaders 11,000 settlements, including the cities of Kalinin and Kaluga, eliminated the danger of encirclement of Tula. The enemy was pushed back from Moscow for 100 to 250 kilometers. The immediate threat to the capital of our motherland disappeared. Hitler suffered the first major defeat in the Second World War. The myth of invincibility of the German armies was finally dispelled. At the end of December 1941, the military council of the 21st Army decided to send another, more numerous extermination squad to the rear of the enemy. It included over 100 border guards and more than 200 Red Army fighters, led by Captain Zakatov. Encouraged by the victories near Moscow, the fighters with great enthusiasm went to fulfill a responsible task. Headed the fighter squadron Captain Nikolai Viktorovich Burtsev, which, as the reader remembers, mentioned in his letter Sasha Zaitsev, a young scout, which Captain Burtsev sent to the city of Lubny. N.V. Burtsev, a native of the town of Kovrov, was drafted into the army in 1932. He graduated from the Border Guard School, served as a chief of outpost. in the 94th Frontier Detachment Nikolai Viktorovich arrived in March 1940 after graduating from the Frunze Military Academy. Literate, brave, well-oriented in a difficult situation, he quickly made thoughtful, correct decisions. By the beginning of the war, Burtsev was the commandant of the 2nd Commandant's office, which was stationed at Siamki Station. He just took office, and a few days later in the woods near the village of Rosokach appeared a gang of 27 people trying to break through the border. Captain Burtsev took a direct part in the operation. The gang was surrounded and liquidated. Captain Burtsev showed exceptional courage, endurance and bravery, skill in leading the commandant's office in Galich and near Popelnia. Especially distinguished his battalion in the defense of the city of Lubny. He behaved just as courageously when leaving the enemy encirclement, having made his way with the border guards to Belgorod. This man was entrusted to lead a new raid to the rear of the enemy. The report of the regiment's headquarters to the Rear Guard Department of the Southwestern Front says on December 27, 1941 at 15.30 the commander of the 21st Army gave an order to the fighter detachment to infiltrate through the front line at night from December 28 to 29, to go to the area of Stanovoy Tract to settle the highway Kharkov-Belgorod-Kursk, to destroy the passing enemy reserves on this road. The term of the operation in the rear of the enemy 3 days. Upon completion of the task, the fighter detachment concentrates in the town of Korocha. Readiness of the detachment to 18 hours on December 28th. Major Zavarzin, who lives in Izhevsky, wrote to me. At that time I served in the 3rd Battalion of the 92nd Regiment. Our battalion and regimental headquarters were located in Korocha. I remember the formation of a fighter detachment was underway. I also volunteered. Our battalion was commanded by Captain Burtsev. The military commander was Senior Political Officer Postnikov, the party commander was Political Officer Terekov, and the platoon commanders were machine gunners Senior Lieutenant Shumakov, machine guns Lieutenant Filonenko, rifle platoon Lieutenant Shemansky. We were given white camouflage coats. Commanders and fighters were preparing weapons. It was very cold. The bolts and all moving parts of machine guns, rifles and machine guns were wiped with alcohol. December 28th, the detachment command gave us a task. In the evening we went to the army headquarters. There we were united with a battalion of the Red Army. We passed the front line calmly. The experience, which was gained during the fighting in the encirclement, had an impact. All border guards were eager to meet the fascists faster and give them a kick in the teeth. Germans at that time mostly held on to villages and hamlets, turning them into their strongholds, and the gaps were covered with barriers, mined or kept under fire of artillery, mortars and machine guns. But by the time of our crossing it had snowed a lot, especially a lot of it had fallen in the gullies and ravines. The barricades lost their value. Reconnaissance, sent to the places through which the path of the fighter squad, found gaps in the enemy defences. All night the detachment went through ravines and forests. At 6 o'clock on December 29th, border guards and Red Army fighters entered the farm Kalinin. The farmers were surprised when so many of our fighters appeared in the rear of the Germans. They willingly treated the border guards with everything they had. And as if casually asked what, ours drove the Germans out of Belgorod, now they won't come here anymore. And they told about their hard lot. They especially complained about the headman, who, according to them, was a traitor and an active collaborator of the Germans. He took away cattle and gave away Soviet activists. He had been tried under Soviet rule, but now he was working for the enemy. Captain Burtsev instructed Senior Lieutenant Kovalenko to check these data. Everything was confirmed. With great zeal and gloating, the headman took from his fellow villagers cattle, bread, fur coats, boots, in short, everything he could, and handed it over to the German command. The traitor was immediately tried. Leaving the hospitable farm Kalinin, the border guards took the blood-sucking headman with them. A few kilometers from the village he was read the sentence, firing squad. The sentence, announced by Senior Lieutenant Kovalenko, was immediately carried out. The extermination squad arrived in the specified area at daylight. They stopped in the forest not far from the highway. They sent out patrols, reconnaissance. Commanders decided how to better fulfill the combat task and paralyze the movement of German troops on the important highway Kharkov-Belgorod-Kursk. By 8 o'clock in the morning of December 30th, Border Guards and Red Army fighters took a position on the edge of a large forest near the farm Beregovogo 30 kilometers north of Belgorod. Closest to the road was a platoon of machine gunners commanded by Senior Lieutenant Shumakov. Shumakov ordered to cut several spans of the telephone line connecting Belgorod with Oboyenu. Sergeant Bondarenko, a participant of this raid who later continued to serve in the unit I commanded, told me. In the Extermination squad, I was in Shumakov's platoon. We occupied a circular defense in the forest. The senior lieutenant placed observers on the edge of the forest, the rest of the fighters entrenched. In the center of the defense was the command post of the detachment. We did not know exactly where to expect the enemy from Belgorod or from Oboyan, but we understood that Hitlerites will certainly appear on the road, as fields and woods were covered with snow. I don't remember how long we lay there, as our observers reported. On the road from Oboyan, an automobile is approaching. "Do not open fire without a command," ordered Senior Lieutenant Shumakov. The distance between the car and the platoon was rapidly shrinking. 150 meters. It's time. Shumakov gives the signal fire. At point-blank range hit the machine gunners and machine gunners. 12 Hitler invaders were gone. And again came the frosty silence. The soldiers were talking. Not enough, we cut them down. At 15 o'clock now from Belgorod, 2 enemy cars approached the forest. At the destroyed communication line, the Germans stopped, got off the cars, began to find out why the wires were torn. Fire. Lieutenant Filonenko commanded his machine gunners. One by one, the grey figures of fascists fell on the snow-covered Kursk ground. Automobiles burst into flames. A passenger car was frozen not far away. The chauffeur put his head down on the steering wheel. A German officer fell out of the door. And again everything went quiet. The soldiers brought a sack with service mail and letters of Hitler's soldiers. In the report of the regiment's headquarters it says 16.00. From Belgorod on the road detected an enemy column, an armoured car and 7 vehicles with infantry. The column stopped 400 meters from the lying border guards. The armoured car opened fire. Up to 2 companies of enemy soldiers turned in a chain and attacked the southwestern edge of the forest. In the fierce battle the enemy was demoralized and fled in panic to the village of Penki, leaving more than 140 killed and wounded. Captain Burtsev's fighter detachment fulfilled the task set by the command. Border guards and fighters of the Red Army concentrated in the tract Stanovoye. At night they withdrew to the east. The detachment was again in the farm Kalinin, located far from the roads. After sleepless nights and intense fighting, people were tired and cold. It was decided to give the personnel a rest and the next night to go to their own. Having set up a combat guard, Captain Burtsev allowed the rest to settle down in the houses. A blizzard was blowing. It was bitter frost. It was difficult to assume that in such a wilderness the enemy would attack the trail of the detachment. But it happened. Reinforced infantry battalion of Hitlerites stealthily approached the farm. The fascists broke into the southeastern outskirts of the village, where the Red Army soldiers were located. A fierce street fight ensued. Border guards under the command of Captain Burtsev rushed to the aid of Captain Zakatov's men. Bold and decisive counterattack, Germans were knocked out of the farm. Then the fascists, having blocked the exits from the settlement, began to methodically bombard it with mortars. Captains Burtsev and Zakatov decided to break the ring of encirclement. They raised fighters to the attack. In several places the barriers were crushed. The detachment with a fight went to the station Titovino and there broke through the enemy defences to the fighting order of the 84th Infantry Division. The report on the results of this operation says the fighter detachment held the main highway Belgorod-Kursk for 2 days. In the battle, more than 300 Hitlerites were destroyed, 13 automobiles were burned, a bag with important official documents was captured. Captain Burtsev, Senior Lieutenant Filonenko, Sergeants Bondarenko, Sergeyev, soldiers Filipov, Morozov, Vorobiev, Malakin, Our deputy political officer, Slepchikov, and weapon master Sergeant Ostakov distinguished themselves in the battle. All of them were presented to government awards by the commander of the 21st Army. The head of the rear guard of the South-Western Front, Major General Rogatin. When performing this combat operation in the rear of the enemy, heroically fell commander of the detachment Captain Burtsev, political officer Tarakov, Lieutenant Shamansky, and 8 more fighters, whose names could not be established. In the fall and winter of 1941, a large number of extermination detachments, battalions and even regiments operated in the rear of the German troops. One of such regiments, formed in October 1941, was commanded by Colonel A. Y. Markonkov, who before the war was the head of the 94th Border Detachment. On November 7, 1941, the regiment participated in the parade on Red Square in Moscow, and on November 9th the first groups of fighters were sent to the rear of the enemy. The first to cross the front line was Captain Moiseyev's fighter detachment, which cut the Minsk highway. Then the same detachments began to operate in the areas of Ruza, Dorokov, Rogachev, Narofominsk. Only in the area of Moshaisk from December 6, 1941 to January 4, 1942 were sent more than 30 extermination squads. Fighters destroyed here 313 Hitlerites, 1 heavy gun, 16 trucks and 5 cars, cut more than in 250 places telephone communication, and more than once captured important documents of the enemy. Border guards performed during this period, and another important combat task. We are talking about our snipers who were directly in the fighting order of the Red Army units, causing the enemy tangible damage. So in the combat orders of the 21st Army, our border snipers were lying on the snow-covered fields of Belgorod region for 2 months, tracking down Hitlerites. Every day they increased the account of the destroyed fascists, for killed our comrades, for destroyed towns and villages, for the blood and tears of mothers. They took revenge on the enemy, making their contribution to the defeat of the Nazi invaders. In total, snipers of our 92nd Regiment killed more than 3,000 soldiers and officers of the enemy. Border snipers successfully operated in other parts of the huge Soviet-German front, killing tens of thousands of fascist soldiers and officers in a short time. Border Guards snipers were marked by special orders of army commanders. Many of them were awarded orders and medals. Border Guards under the command of Major Dienigo struck a blow on the northeastern outskirts of the town of Lubny. They threw the enemy back to the cemetery and gained a foothold in the adjacent streets. During the breakthrough, Major Dienigo fell to the death of the brave. Captain Mirziashvili took command of the Border Guards. The enemy failed to assess the situation correctly and decided that all the defending troops were breaking through to Lubny. Tanks and infantry of Hitlerites rushed to the city. At this moment the enemy was counterattacked by a group under the command of Battalion Commissar Avdyukin. Having sowed panic in the ranks of fascists, it broke through the ring of encirclement and safely left to the woods. Major Wróblewski took the rest of the regiment out of the battle. About how the battle ended for the Border Guards, commanded by Captain Mirziashvili, recalls a former Border Guard captain of the reserve Ivan Ivanovich Komarov, when our unit under the command of Sergeant Belakayev reached the outermost house. We were told to dig in. Soon other units involved in the counterattack came up. They also began to entrench. The firing had almost subsided, and then from the side where the regiment was defending, tanks moved. At first we thought that it was coming to support us. But the tanks turned around and began to irrigate our trenches. These tanks were followed by others, and further German machine gunners moved in a dense chain. The secretary of the Komsomol organization of the company, Private Biryukov, shouted, "We'll fight to the last drop of blood." Fire at the enemy. 2 Border Guards, who were not far from our unit, stood up to their full height and threw Molotov cocktails at one of the tanks. In this last fight with the enemy heroically fought machine gunners Alexander Ivanov and Alexei Pershin, company foreman Yegor Kramov, Border Guard Ivan Moros, and many others. Captain M.D. Mirziashvili, who led the counter-attacking units after the death of Major Dienigo, died a brave death in battle. According to eyewitnesses, he led the fighters into the attack on a white horse and was hit by a machine gun of a German tank. Captain Mikhail Mirziashvili was born in Georgia, from the village of Ashi, Dusheti district. From the age of 22, he was in the army, graduated from the Higher Border Guard School. In the 94th Detachment he served since 1940 as an Assistant Chief of Staff Department. Captain Mirziashvili's wife and son were evacuated from the border at the beginning of the war, and now live in Tbilisi. They visited the places where Mikhail Mirziashvili fought, who was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner for the battle in Lubny. Many years later, during a trip to the places of former battles, I met Major of the Reserve Philip Nikitovich Vigranenko in the town of Lubny. He settled in these places after finishing his military service. He was interested in why in the town, which is so far from the border, residents often remember the fighters in green caps. So the former officer started searching for the participants of the September battles for Lubny and, when we met, told about 2 episodes. It is impossible not to mention them. Maybe they will also name a lieutenant border guard who was shooting from the enemies on the outskirts of the city. Mortally wounded, he began to climb the stairs to the 2nd floor of the house. Here he was surrounded by fascists. The lieutenant fired his last shot at them, but he was killed himself. However, he didn't fall down the stairs. He remained standing dead with a pistol clutched in his hand. Another case also happened on the outskirts of the city. 3 border guards with a hand machine gun were holding back the fascists who were advancing on them. There were no more of their own around. The soldiers hid in the attic of the house. The unequal fight lasted for a long time. Finally, 1 fighter was left alive. But the machine gun did not stop. Only with the onset of darkness the fire from the attic stopped. At night, Hitlerites penetrated into the house and threw grenades at the daredevil. But to approach to it, even dead fascists did not dare. In the morning, the body of the border guard was lowered to the ground. The German officer ordered the soldiers to line up, and, commanding helmets down before the brave, said one must fight like this Russian soldier. In these stories, perhaps not everything is accurate. Passed on by word of mouth, they probably differ in some way from what actually happened. But they faithfully reflect the fighting spirit with which the border guards of the 94th Detachment fought in that last battle. Despite the fact that the forces were unequal, says the assistant to the military commander of the detachment on Komsomol work P. Letishev, the border guards did not lose heart, did not get timid. On the contrary, they were full of optimism and desire to fulfill their orders at all costs. Everyone I saw in this battle stood to the death, fought to the end. The inhabitants of Lubny have not forgotten this heroic feat. At Lubno City Executive Committee, a commission has been established to immortalize the memory of border guard soldiers who defended the Soviet land from the enemies with such courage. Pupils and teachers of school know. 7 have compiled a detailed history of the September military events, looking for and finding items of military equipment at the sites of former battles. In the school corner of military glory are kept a helmet, a flask and a bowler with the inscription Lipak V. Young pathfinders of the city found in the area of Forestry Well, about which there are legends. The well was almost in the centre of our defence. The inhabitants of Novaki, Krugliki and Klepachi villages tell that when the border guards had exhausted all possibilities of resistance and they began to leave to Lubny Forest, a group of soldiers surrounded by German tanks and machine gunners remained at the well. Not wishing to surrender to the enemy, the soldiers approached the well, fired the last shots at the Nazis, and threw themselves down with their weapons. The mystery of the well has not been solved. In May 1975, on the eve of the 30th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War, the Mound of Glory was erected near the well. On the memorial slab is written, "Stop, comrade, friend and brother. Here the heroic warriors sleep with eternal sleep. Honor their memory. Call out your heart, bow to the grave chestnut alley, leads to the kurgan." At its beginning there is a stone block with the inscription to the soldiers of the 94th Border Regiment, who died a brave death in 1941. Eternal glory, the names of many of those who at the cost of their lives kept the superior forces of Hitlerites at the city for several days, are unknown. In May 1968, to the day of 50th anniversary of frontier troops, in many city, regional and Republican newspapers, was published the material distributed by TASS about the fighting way of 94th Frontier Detachment. Many participants and eyewitnesses of the battles near the town of Lubny responded to it. In some letters, new names of heroes were called. I, a former border guard of the 94th Border Guard Detachment, wrote from Minsk. A. To Terev, well remember every battle described in the article, especially near the town of Lubny. Left without artillery support, the border guards destroyed fascist tanks and armoured vehicles with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Many times we had to shout hurrah to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Especially I remembered Junior Sergeant Kapustin, who fearlessly fought together with soldiers of his department. About courage of Junior Sergeant Erin, border guards Lakachev and Subbatin, who fought the enemy to the last cartridge, wrote former border guard P. Nikolin, who lives in the village of Kuznetsov, Chernyshinsky district, Perm region. And here is what I, Kocherga, a resident of the town of Lubny, reported. I remember well the battle near our town. Coming out of the forest, border guards with cries of hurrah occupied the entire outskirts of the city. They were poorly armed, someone with a rifle, someone with a grenade, someone with a bottle with a combustible mixture, but they were in a fighting mood, burning with desire to knock Hitlerites out of the city. Border guards captured the German headquarters, and having taken weapons and ammunition of Hitlerites who fled from there, moved to the center of the city. There they attacked the tanks standing in the streets. I still cannot forget this, now seeming almost reckless, desperate bravery. With unparalleled courage fought with the hated enemy on the fields of Lubnanshchina border guards of the 94th Border Guard, Detachment Sergeant Sergei Moscovoy Boris Filipovich, Sergeants Rusanov Sergei Mikhail Mikhailovich, Nikitin Mikhail Alexeyevich, Kryukov Nikolai Pavlovich, Sergeyev Alexey Ivanovich, Kapustin, Dernin, Border Guards Chernik Grigory Fedorovich, Vorobiev Alexei, Mokogon Mikhail, Potapov, Zolotarev, Timonov. All of them fell with the death of heroes. On May 28, 1968, on the day of the 50th anniversary of the border troops, on the place of the heroic battle Vasilenkovo Field, by the decision of Lubna District Executive Committee of the Council of Workers' Deputies, a monument was erected, the opening of which was attended by thousands of residents of the city and surrounding villages. On the granite pedestal is written to the heroic soldiers of the 94th Frontier Regiment, who died a brave death in the battles for the Soviet motherland with the Nazi invaders on 17.9.1941. Here are buried Captain Mrzyashvili Mikhail Dmitrievich, Platoon Commander Belotsakovsky Mikhail Sergeyevich, Junior Lieutenant Shur Nikolai Pavlovich, Sergeant Vorobiev Alexander Ivanovich, Junior Sergeant Igorenkov Mikhail Yakovovich, Private Ivanko Ivan Vasilievich, Private Ivanov Alexander Alexandrovich, Private Krugloyev Fedor Alexeyevich, Private Likachev Alexey Konstantinovich, Private Mukin Alexander Alexandrovich, Private Smirnov, and 9 unknown soldiers, border guards. Near the monument there is a plate, Dear Friends of Lubny. Lubny. We express our deep gratitude and sincere recognition for preserving the grave of Captain Mikhail Mrzyashvili, who died fighting the German invaders on September 17, 1941. Mrzyashvili's family. To commemorate the feat of the soldiers of the 94th Frontier Regiment, Lomanaya Street was renamed into Frontier Guards Street. An obelisk was erected in the village Krugliki, where the ashes of 58 soldiers together with the Chief of Staff of the regiment, Major Dina Polikarp Filipovich, rest. There is a mass grave in the village Olshanka, where 8 border guards of the 94th Detachment, including 4 soldiers of the 10th Outpost, Sergeant Mikhailov Alexander Mikhailovich, Junior Sergeant Bogotayev Mitrofan Vasilievich, border guards Mikhailov Sergei Mikhailovich and Sychev Mikhail Fedorovich, who fell in an unequal, cruel battle with fascist tanks, sleep in eternal sleep. In December 1968, I received a letter from Kiev from Major General Kozlov, the head of the political department of the Western Frontier District. He wrote, as you already know, on September 4th this year in the village Olshanka reburial of the remains of soldiers of the 94th Frontier Regiment, who died in battle with the German invaders in September 1941. When opening the grave, several medallions were found. On the paper insert of one of the medallions we managed to read the following text: Treshenyuk Nikolai Fedorovich, born in 1921, a native of the Smolensk region. In this connection, I kindly ask you and your fellow soldiers to inform us whether Trishchenyuk or Trishchenko Nikolai Fedorovich served in the 94th Border Regiment, and in particular at your outpost. Employees of the Central Archive of the Soviet Army reported the shooter of the 8th outpost of the 94th Frontier Detachment, Trishchenyuk Nikolai Fedorovich, born in 1921, a native of Smolensk region, is listed as missing in action in September 1941. During the opening of the grave was also found a half-eaten crust from the identity card. On the piece of cardboard, which had crumbled from the touch, it was possible to make out the end of only one word ... Shov. A comparison with the identity card of that period showed that the syllable read was nothing but the ending of the surname of the person to whom the card belonged. In the staff duty book, kept in the Central Archive of the Border Troops, it was written Lieutenant Fursov, Chief of Communications of the Battalion of the 94th Border Detachment. The personal file of Lieutenant Viktor Semyonovich Fursov was also found. It said that he was born in 1920 in the city of Kursk. He graduated from the Border Guard School in 1941. On the last page there was also such a certificate in the battles in September 1941 he was missing in action. There is almost no doubt that the found crust from the ID card belonged to Lieutenant Fursov, because there was no other commander in the 94th Frontier Troops whose surname would end in owl. Apparently, Fursov died on Vasilenkovo Field, being a part of the control cell of the battalion commander Captain Mirziashvili. In Lubny, another page of the combat exploits of the frontier guards of our detachment was opened. The rigger from the plant communer Nikolai Krivobok found out that in the garden of the local resident G.P. Kulik there is a grave where unknown heroes who died in the battles during the defense of Lubny in September 1941 are buried. He tracked down the people who buried the brave soldiers. Galina Mironovna Savchenko and Galina Konstantinovna Bezuglaya have been taking care of the grave all this time. Here is what GM Savchenko told about the nameless heroes. That day I was sitting in a trench behind our house. The fascists had already occupied the city, but on the outskirts of it was still shooting. Then I heard shouts of hurrah. I jumped out of the trench and saw how our soldiers were pushing the Hitlerites from Shepelevsky Forest. Right in our garden a hand-to-hand fight began. Fascists were beaten a lot, and we buried our border guards together with Bezugla in the garden. By the decision of the Executive Committee of the City Council, the Commission reburied the fallen soldiers. Their remains were transferred to a mass grave on Vasilenkovo Field. When opening were found corroded rifles with bayonets, decayed ammunition pouches. Under a piece of overcoat cloth, a Komsomol ticket, a Red Army book, agitator's notebook, on the first page of which one could still read the words of the call, "Beat the fascist beast." A medallion was also found. On the paper insert managed to read Ryabkov Ivan Ivanovich, Border Guard, born in 1919, a native of the Leningrad region. So another name of the hero, who fell in a cruel, unequal battle, was established. Together with Fedor Ivanovich Vrublevsky, Peter Andreevich Letishev, Vasily Alexandrovich Lebedev, Vasily Vasilievich Borisov, we visited the village of Novaki, where in the fall of 1941 was the command post of our regiment. How many new houses there are here now, what beautiful economic and administrative buildings. Collective farm fields are green, gardens are blooming. Even ravines with yellowed autumn grass, where border guards of the detachment held back the onslaught of fascist tanks, we recognized with difficulty. The appearance of the village Olshanka has also changed. There is no longer a church with a bell tower, from which fascist machine gunners pressed us to the ground. That place is now a club. And on the square is a monument to the fallen soldiers, border guards of the 94th Detachment, who came here from the Carpathian Mountains. Once I received a letter from a N. Zaitsev from Transcarpathia. Don't be surprised that a stranger writes to you. In 1968 in the Lubny newspaper was printed a note about a boy named Vitia, who helped the border guards in September 1941. My mother read this note and informed the editorial office that, in all probability, it was about me, her son Sasha. The editors asked me to write about those events, of which I became an involuntary participant. I want to tell you something as a person who collects material about the soldiers of the 94th Frontier Detachment. At that time I was 14 years old. As the front approached Lubny, my mother decided to leave the city with me and my little brother. Our father was a political officer, and my mother feared for our fate. At that time, many families of servicemen, party and Soviet workers were leaving the city. But we could not evacuate. The trains were no longer running. Then we went to the village of Krugliki, where we met border guards. I immediately rushed to the soldiers and asked them to take me in. They started to give me various small assignments to carry something, to bring something, to do something else. But one day their commander, a captain, called me up and introduced me to the major. They asked me if I was not afraid to go on reconnaissance in the town of Lubny. I answered that I was not afraid. Then they explained what they needed to find out. They were especially interested in the bridges over the Sula. I will not tell you how I walked around the city, how I got a couple of times on the neck from Hitlerites for the fact that I came close to tanks, guns. Everything turned out all right. The captain was very happy when he saw me safe and sound. We sat down on the grass and I told about what I had seen and drew a scheme. The captain told me what symbols to use to mark certain objects. Then he hid it all in a field bag, hugged me, and went somewhere. The last time I saw the captain was in the village of Novaki. We were together looking for a case of bottles with flammable liquid, which had disappeared somewhere. I don't remember whether we found it or not. After the brutal battles I witnessed, the border guards went into the forest. I asked to go with them, but they refused. The captain said that I should stay in Novaki for the time being and guide the lagging border guards into the forest. I was on duty until dawn and met only 3 fighters. We stayed in the village for a few more days and decided to go home again. On the way we almost disappeared because of a trifle. In a hurry my mother grabbed my father's tanker's uniform with cubes on the buttonholes. Ear German was checking the things. When he saw the uniform he started shouting Kommissar. Commendator my mother explained to him in German that she was a seamstress and had just accidentally put in the suitcase a French coat that she had sewn to order. Luckily the German believed it, or it's hard to say how it would have ended. I had a revolver and a grenade in my pocket. I don't know how I would have used it, but I was in a belligerent mood. Then came the nightmarish 2-year occupation. There's a lot to tell about that too. There were all sorts of things, even being hijacked to Germany and escaping on a train. I served the enemy as best I could. That's all for now. It is a pity that the fate of that captain is still unknown to me. I want to answer Alexander Nikolaevich Zaitsev, our scout Sasha, in the area of MTS, where he was. The defense was occupied by the battalion of Captain Burtsev. Apparently it was he who sent Sasha to scout. Captain Burtsev safely came out with his men from the enemy encirclement and still fought with the Nazi invaders. As readers have noticed in the story about the battle in the town of Lubny now and then mentioned bottles with incendiary mixture, with the help of which the border guards fought with Nazi tanks. It may seem whether the author is not carried away by it. Where did the soldiers of the 94th Detachment get so many bottles that they are used here and there? Isn't the story about the bottles made up to make the fight with the enemy's tanks believable? There were Molotov cocktails, they were made in the city, but we didn't know who did it. What made it clearer was this letter deeply respected Mikhail Grigorievich. When you wrote your book, did not you have a question, where did thousands of anti-tank incendiary bottles come from in Lubny? Well, we made these bottles with our own hands. Our military unit was engaged in their manufacture. The letter was from a lieutenant colonel engineer of the reserve Valery Mikhailovich Galak, who in September 1941 was in Lubny, where the chemical polygon of the Southwestern Front was relocated. VM. Galak was the head of the chemical laboratory of the polygon. He, together with Professor V.S. Kobzarenko, produced bottles with incendiary mixture by order of the head of the Front Chemist Department, Major General of Technical Troops D.E. Pastukov at the local distillery. Lubny was the 3rd place where these bottles were produced. At the beginning of the war they were made in Kiev and then in Zolotonosha. Later in Voronezh and Stalingrad. Attached to the letter was an article by VM Galak. Nazi tanks are burning, published in the newspaper of the Red Banner Kiev Military District Leninskoye Znamya. It tells about those who were engaged in mass production of bottles with combustible mixture for the front. These were heroic Soviet women from the Kiev, Zolotonosha and Lubny distilleries. Labour at these enterprises was truly heroic, recalls V.M. Galak, pourers and pickers of phosphorus containing liquid in the heat of July and August 1941, worked in rubber suits for 10 to 12 hours. If any of the workers was uncomfortable, she asked to pour cold water from the hose, and then she would go back to the machine. Sulfuric acid was used for the production of some types of fuses. Once pourer Anastasia Odorchenko carried from the warehouse to the shop a large open glass vessel filled to the brim with sulfuric acid. On the way, the acid began to spill and flow down her cheek, neck, chest and back. Acid was an acutely scarce product. Despite the hellish pain, Odorchenko carried the vessel to the shop floor, let it be removed from her shoulder, and only then was she able to receive first aid. With severe burns, she was sent to the hospital. V.M. Galak reported the names of some female patriots who made anti-tank incendiary bottles for us at the Lubny plant. They are Maria Stryaha, Galina Demchenko, Maria Kovalenko, Katerina Konkova, sisters Varvara and Galina Kushenko, Maria and Evdokia Berdium. Maria Nikitichna Strya, respected by all, works at the plant and now. Galina Kushenko was shot by fascists as a communist. Thank you, dear women from the town of Lubny, who helped us in the harsh times. There were the last minutes of the battle near Lubny. Counter-attacking groups, having taken the blow, diverted the attention of the Germans from the main forces of the regiment, which allowed Major Wróblewski to give an order to the border guards to withdraw to the Lubny forest. This order did not reach only our company. Ivan Ivanenko, a border guard liaison sent from the regiment headquarters, was unable to transmit the order. On his way were fascist machine gunners and tanks. Ivanenko died heroically. Our defence area from the village Krugliki to the house of the forester stretched for almost 4 kilometres. It was considered that we were in the reserve of the regiment commander, but in the current situation this definition turned out to be inaccurate. The front was everywhere. We were fighting in an encirclement. Somewhere in the middle of the day, when some of the border guards had already withdrawn into the forest, German aviation appeared over Vasilenkov Field. Drowning out artillery cannonade, gunfire of tanks, bombs began to burst on the field and near our trenches. Smoke curtain from bomb bursts densely shrouded the regiment's positions. Nazi tanks broke through to the village Krugliki, clearly heard the pounding of machine guns, directly hit the tanks. Several cars bypass a deep ravine and are rapidly approaching us. On the road and from the village Klepachi appeared black and yellow boxes with white crosses. From 3 sides of the tanks bypass the company's stronghold. There is no one around. Our defence is silent. The simple thought that we are alone does not reach me immediately. With me only border guards Makarov, Erdakov, Volkov, Tsipin, Dmitriev, Kolesnikov, Shlaktin. We have to withdraw. I'm transmitting along the chain everyone into the ravine. Suddenly we run into a woman in the ravine. Your men went that way. She's pointing towards the forest. We climbed up the steep wall with difficulty. Desperate machine gun fire can be heard in the distance, shells whizzing by. They burst behind and ahead of us. The Germans are hitting indiscriminately. Hiding in the crops, caught on our way, we reached the forest. Here on the edge of the forest we met a group of border guards from the 9th Company, 10 soldiers, headed by political officer Konstantin Kuzenkov. All border guards were wounded, including Kuzenkov. The right hand of the political officer was hanging on a bloody bandage. At the edge of the forest shells began to burst, and we hurried to take shelter in the forest. Heavy shelling forced us to disperse in different directions. Here, in the forest, we got our hands on a German leaflet, which depicted a section of the map in the strip of the southwestern front, with the encircled grouping of our troops. The text was written in Russian. The leaflet suggested surrendering as prisoners of war, giving away NKVD officers, commissars and Jews. Those who surrendered were guaranteed life by the German command. Curiously, the leaflet mentioned the defeat of Stalin's Guards, the 20th, 91st, 93rd and 94th Border Guard detachments. I tore up the leaflet and thought to myself we must have done a great disservice to the Germans if the fascist propagandists remembered about us. Border Guards, even here, beyond the Dnieper, 1,000 kilometers from the border. By evening we came upon our own. Together with Major Wróblewski and Battalion Commissar Avdyukin, there were 120–150 people gathered in the forest. However, we could not delay here. We had no food and ammunition. 7 men of our outpost had only 1 grenade left. 3 cartridges were saved in the clip of my pistol, and a few cartridges each of the soldiers. We had no communication. We did not know what the situation at the front was now, where our own men were. When it got dark, the regiment commander and the commissar gathered the commanders and brought to our attention their decision. The essence of it was to move to the north, in the direction of the village of Kitsi, where the rear of the regiment was to be located and where we could count on replenishment of ammunition and food. If we did not find our rear in Kitsi, we should fight our way further north, to the army rear in Gorodish. In case we fail here too, it is necessary to force the Sula and go to the Popovsky forest, spreading along the bank of the Korol River, and there, if necessary, to force Korol. The assembly point was planned in the area of the town of Akhtarkaka. All night we walked through the forest, and only in the morning we found ourselves on its outskirts. Through the pre-morning fog we could see a clearing where a huge herd of cows was resting. About a kilometre away we could see a village. A breeze blew and the fog spread. We saw that the village was full of German tanks, cars and artillery. Hitlerites settled down carelessly, no guards, except for a few sentries by the road. Ahead clearly loomed the forest. That's where we had to get to. But how to cross the clearing unnoticed? One of the border guards asked in surprise. Where did so many cows come from? After thinking about it, border guard Schleichtin noticed. They must have been driving evacuated cattle, but the Germans cut them off. Major Wróblewski ordered to build people and ducking down to pass by the herd without noise. So our Björnishki served us well. We skipped almost open place under the nose of the Germans. However, no sooner had we gone deep into the oak forest that surrounded us than we heard the noise of engines. Without a command, everyone lay down on both sides of the road. A German tank appeared. Behind it, about 50 meters away, followed a car with a covered body. Someone had a bunch of grenades. As soon as the tank came to a small bridge over a forest stream, the bundle flew under the track. There was an explosion. The tank stopped. With a friendly volley, we hit the vehicle with rifles. It slid into the ditch. The tarpaulin and the engine caught fire. German soldiers began to jump out of the car, but they had no time to run away from the car, as they were overtaken by our bullets. In this short fight, more than 24 fascist soldiers were destroyed. Tanks roared in the village. We had to leave the road and go deep into the thickets. Here we met a group of Poltava and Lubny communists, future partisans. They supplied us with food. In the afternoon of September 18th we came to Kitsi, but our rear was not there. We moved to Gorodish, not knowing how dramatic was the situation for the whole southwestern front at that time. It was on September 18th that the withdrawal of the 37th Army from the Kiev fortification began by the decision of the Stavka. Front Commander General Kirponos decided to withdraw the main forces of the front from the encirclement. On the night of September 19th, General Kirponos moved from Pyryatin to Gorodishche together with the military council and the headquarters of the southwestern front. Battles began when in the fight with the enemy generals often entered as soldiers. A mine fragment in the grove Shumekovo, which is near the farm Dryakovshchina, was killed Front Commander MP Kirponos. But even in these incredibly difficult conditions, many brave, proactive commanders at the head of significant forces of units and formations managed to break through the huge thickness of German troops and go to their own. In the collection of documents Frontier Troops during the Great Patriotic War, there is a report note of the head of the troops to protect the rear of the southwestern front, Colonel Rogatin. He wrote how the border guards, who were in close proximity to the headquarters of the southwestern front, came out of the encirclement. The breakthrough of the German encirclement near the village of Gorodishche and the successful counter-offensive near the village of Luchki, reported Colonel Rogatin. The main and major operations that provided the exit and withdrawal of a large number of personnel of various parts of the southwestern front. In the battles near the villages of Gorodishche, Sencha and Luchki, up to a battalion of German infantry was defeated. 4 medium tanks were hit. 2 anti-tank guns were taken and destroyed, 2 mortars and 80 pieces of mines were taken, 2 trucks were burned, 2 stores of ammunition for machine guns were captured and destroyed, 4 motorcycles and 17 German soldiers and officers were captured. Not knowing what events were happening on the southwestern front, in particular in the village of Gorodishch, we went there, hoping to replenish our ammunition and then continue to act based on the situation. By noon we met our units moving from Gorodishche. In the column of troops followed 2 armoured cars and Emka, in which rode Major General of Aviation. Wróblewski and Avdyukin reported to the general, and he ordered to join the column. Soon Hitlerites discovered us. The aviation appeared. From different sides began to approach tanks and motorized infantry of the enemy. Together with Red Army soldiers, border guards of the regiment entered the battle. We beat Germans from gullies, bushes, coastal reeds, but the forces were too unequal. We had to disperse to act independently. By evening, a small group of border guards, which included the men of our company, gathered in the Plavnias on an island at the confluence of the rivers Udaya and Sula. German motorized units were moving along the roads, shelling fields, bushes and reeds. Hitlerites did not calm down, and at night. Nazi machine guns did not let the silence settle down. Then in one, then in another place tracer arrows penetrated the darkness, rockets flew up into the sky. Cars roared on the roads without ceasing for a minute. We lay in the wet grass and thought how to fight our way through. Dawn crept up imperceptibly. The rumble on the roads subsided a little. A thick fog hung over Uday and Sula. "We must cross the river," said Captain Rakoff, and turned to me, who is a good swimmer. "Look, there are 2 boats in the bushes on the other bank. Bring them here." "May I?" "Go ahead and swim," agreed Rakoff. With Astrakhan fisherman Makarov we went to the river. The Sula in this place is not wide, but deep, overgrown with algae near the banks. As soon as we were in the water, our clothes bubbled up and our bodies were scorched by cold jets. We had to swim almost from the shore. Algae entangled our arms and legs, pulling us to the bottom. We could hardly overcome the rapid, and barely dragging our feet, we got to the opposite shore. The crossing began. Boats were running across the river, carrying people from the islet. On the other side of the river, the vegetable gardens began at once. A little farther away stood a shabby hut, and behind it the first houses of the village of Berezotokya. Somewhere chimneys were already smoking. The owner of the old hut, an elderly woman, seemed to be waiting for us. She brought all her meagre stock of food and gave it to us. We started to eat, but then machine gun bursts rang out. Bullets flew over our heads to the other side of the river. Apparently the Nazis had discovered our crossing. The woman said that we should go to the field where corn and sunflowers grew. Having run across the road, we rushed there. Several huts covered us from the side. But the Germans still noticed the movement. A long line from a tank machine gun crashed into the roof of the nearest house. Getting away from the fire, we skidded into some orchard, and then found ourselves in sunflower and corn crops. The birch tree was left far behind. The border guards, led by Major Wróblewski and Battalion Commissar Avdyukin, were coming out of the encirclement in the same way. Having crossed the Sula, they fought their way through the enemy barricades, destroying military equipment and enemy manpower. Local residents rendered great help to fighters and commanders. They helped us in every way they could. They fed us, pointed out fords, ferried us across the rivers by boat, left seriously wounded. One day we found ourselves near some village. We settled in sunflower crops for the day, and then women found us and brought us food. Only Sergei Tsipin, whose wound had festered by that time, and he had a high fever, refused to eat. Sergei was so exhausted that he could not walk further on his own. It was feared that he had blood poisoning, and it was becoming risky to carry him further. It was not easy to part with Tsipin, but the women assured him that they would shelter and cure him. Sergei Tsipin stayed in the village, the name of which I cannot remember. Tsipin's further fate is unknown. On September 20th, on the 3rd day of the journey, we crossed the Romoden-Belgorod railroad at the station Dubrovka. It was already dark, but silhouettes of houses loomed ahead. The border guards had not eaten anything for a long time. and Captain Rukov decided to look into the village. We reached the outskirts of the village. There were few houses in the thicket of gardens, and not a soul on the streets. We knocked at the outermost house. Silence. We went further. Makarov and I were in front, our platoon's men were behind us, and then the company commander Captain Rykov, Lieutenant Simonov, and border guards from Belotsakovsky's platoon with Petty Officer Parfanov. Having passed several houses, we found ourselves in a small alley near some farm. And then, as if from under the ground, a man grew up in front of us. He was dressed in our general's overcoat, but he had his cap down over his ears. A German. He stood like a mummy, confused or dozing. Only when we passed him and got 100 meters away he shouted, "Halt." Petty Officer Parfanov gave a line from his automatic rifle. In the village there was shooting. Flares flew into the sky, motorcycles rattled. At first we walked uphill, then we descended into a gully until the water sloshed under our feet. Behind us there was continuous shooting, rumbling of cars, flickering headlights. There was nothing to fight with the Germans. We had weapons, no ammunition. I had the only grenade, just in case. And the water kept coming. There was no way to walk. We began to be sucked in by the cold swamp. We stopped. No one could remember where we were going, to the west or to the east. The night was dark and cloudy. There was no way to orient ourselves. There was only one way out: to stand in the water until morning. When dawn broke, we saw the swampy floodplain of the river. Having got out of the water, we walked along the edge of the gully along the road. We walked for a long time. Finally, we saw the edge of a big forest. We hurried to it. To our surprise, there were many people in the forest, military and civilian. It turned out that it was Popov's forest. By evening, Captain Rukov ordered to allocate people and send them to the villages for food. From our platoon went Alexei Makarov and Alexander Yerdakov. They brought bread, boiled potatoes, cucumbers, and at the same time scouted where we could cross the Coral Ford. Having fortified ourselves, we began to make our way to the river. Coral was smoking with cold vapor of fog. One by one the border guards entered the water. Soon it penetrated into their boots, then reached their knees. It did not rise higher. The river was indeed shallow but wide. Its floodplains, overgrown with reeds and sedges, stretched for a long time. I don't remember how long we walked, but finally it stopped squelching under our feet. A little more, and we were sitting on dry ground, pouring water out of our boots. This activity had to be suddenly interrupted. The silence was broken by gunshots, and flares hung over the river. On the right and left, automatic rifles rang out. Quickly pulling on our boots, we ducked to the side. Now only the border guards of the outpost were near me: Makarov, Adakov, Volkov, Kuzmin, Kolesnikov. A little later Dmitriev joined, but somewhere Shlaktin lagged behind. The rest of the night we wandered along the fields until we came upon sunflower crops. We stayed there and waited for the dawn. That September day dragged on for a long time. The Germans were moving around on the roads, and not far away in the village we could hear the crying of children. From time to time dogs barked and roosters crowed. Toward evening Makarov turned to me. "Comrade Lieutenant, permission to go to the village for food." I hesitated. What if there were Germans in the village? I could starve for a day. As if guessing my thoughts, Makarov said, "But you do not worry, Comrade Chief, I will pass between the legs of the Krauts." "All right," I agreed. "Only take Kolesnikov with you." The border guards disappeared in the evening twilight, and we remained lying among the sunflowers, warily listening to every rustle. For some reason, when Makarov left, I remembered an incident connected with this border guard, which took place before the war. Makarov's character was not very strict, sharp-tongued, mocking, but his service in protecting the state border was impeccable. That was what disposes him. Soon after my arrival at the outpost, I began to send him as a senior outfit. By the end of 1940, the outpost was replenished with fighters from the internal troops of the NKVD. Naturally, they did not know the border service. And one day, having arrived to receive a combat order to protect the border, Makarov reported, "Comrade Chief of the outpost, The border guard unit consisting of Red Army men Shlyaktin, Alexenko and border guard Makarov arrived to receive a combat order. At first it seemed that he just misspoke. But the next day Makarov reported that Shlyaktin and Alexenko were Red Army soldiers, and he was a border guard. Comrade Makarov, what is the difference between Shlyaktin's and Alexenko's uniforms and yours? Nothing, he answered. And why do you only call yourself a border guard? After all, they are also on the staff of our outpost. Yes, that's right, Makarov answered cheerfully. We don't look any different in our uniforms, but they are far from being real border guards, Comrade Chief. They take every bush for a border intruder. They're used to shouting at 100 paces stop, who's coming, you can't get them out of it. Soon Shlyaktin, Alexenko and others who arrived at the outpost from the internal troops learned our harsh and disturbing border service, and Makarov stopped emphasizing his superiority over them. But in my memory this episode remained forever as a part of Makarov himself, a fearless warrior who never got discouraged, never lost heart, who fulfilled more than one of my assignments during the first months of the war, a skillful scout, a real border guard. Suddenly our messengers appeared from the other side. Comrade Chief, whispered Makarov, we have brought food. When we went to the village, there was a man lying in the sunflowers 1/2 kilometer away. Alive or dead? Alive, inserted Kolesnikov, moving. Slowly we passed this 1/2 kilometer. Makarov signalled, everyone stopped. I carefully pulled apart the sunflower stalks. A man, dressed in a black jacket, which was then worn by servicemen of the mechanized units, and an army cap, took out of his pocket a negant. They are ours, I told him quietly. Let one of them come up, he said. I approached. Who are you? He asked. Border guards. I am their commander. Then the man rose from the ground with great difficulty. 2 orders of the red banner gleamed dimly on his uniform. In the buttonholes of the stranger were 4 sleepers each, he said. Let's show each other the documents. You see, I am not alone. I have my subordinates with me, I objected, but then decided let him look at my documents. I showed him my mandate and candidate card, and he held out his party card. So we met Regimental Commissar Ivan Nikiforovich Bogotikov. I was assigned to the political department of the 21st Army, he said. A major and a captain went there with me. But the circumstances were such that we could not reach the place. For 3 days I am at this village. The major and captain went to scout the situation and did not return. We offered the regimental commissar to leave the encirclement together, but we confessed that we were lost last night. We had run into the Germans, and now we had lost all orientation. The regimental commissar gave me a compass, and we took the necessary azimuth and moved to the east. On the way we again made a halt in some crops. Makarov took a piece of bread from our stock and handed it to the regimental commissar. Whether the piece of bread was to blame or the situation in which we found ourselves, only, taking the bread, Bogotikov said in his heart. What you've gotten up to, regimental commissar? You are sneaking around your native land like a thief. We went on our way again, and after a while we came upon 3 large haystacks, standing at a considerable distance from each other. We adapted one of them for sleeping. Simply, we burrowed into the straw and fell asleep. Makarov woke me up. The sun was already high. Ahead, 500 meters away, there was a black forest, and a large settlement could be seen farther away. Comrade Chief, there are 2 soldiers sitting on the far haystack. Indeed, there were 2 soldiers sitting on the haystack, but it was difficult to make out whose soldiers they were, ours or the enemy's. They woke up the regimental commissar and reported to him that observers were seen on the far haystack. You know what, said Bogotikov, ours or strangers, now we have no time to understand. Let's better one by one quickly move into the forest, so it will be more reliable. Where we crawled and where we ran, we reached the forest. Right at the edge of the forest there were 3 guns, next to them there were boxes with shells, and horses were grazing here. I thought the guns and horses were abandoned during the withdrawal of our units. But, having examined the guns, we were convinced that they were in good working order. Here it is, the equipment, Standing in the forest and inactive, one of the border guards was indignant. But then Red Army men with kettles appeared from behind the bushes and, confused, stared at us. Regimental Commissar Bogotikov strictly asked, "Who are they? Why are the guns abandoned?" The sergeant answered cheerfully, "Comrade Regimental Commissar, we went to get breakfast in the kitchen. Why were the guns left unguarded? There are our observers in front on the haystack, and by the river the kitchen and the battery commander's command post." "All right," softened Bogotikov. "How to get to your commander?" Forest path we went down to the river. At the appearance of the regimental commissar commander jumped up and willingly began to explain everything that we were interested. "On that bank Veliki Sorochintsy, they're the headquarters of our cavalry corps," he finished his story. So on September 22nd, 1941, our almost week-long wandering through the enemy rear ended. At the headquarters of the corps we were informed that the assembly point for all those leaving the encirclement was in the town of Aktyrka. Having put ourselves in order and having said goodbye to Regimental Commissar Bogotikov, we left Veliki Sorochintsy. On September 24th, I and 6 border guards of the outpost arrived in Aktyrka. About 1,500 fighters and commanders of various detachments had already gathered here. We were put on a train and sent to Belgorod. The assembly point was located in the schoolyard. Border guards, servicemen of internal troops, gaunt, not shaved for a long time, with weathered faces, in dirty uniforms and broken shoes, were waiting for new assignments. I remember the exit from the encirclement wrote after the war my former assistant platoon commander Sergeant V.A. Lebedev. "I went barefoot, went in big galoshes, wrapping rags around my feet, went barefoot again, covered my feet with burlap when snow fell on the ground. My teeth hurt a lot. There were moments when I was ready to put a bullet in my forehead or lie down on my own grenade. But I pulled myself together and went on, realizing that my life could still be useful, that I still had a lot to settle accounts with the enemy." Many years after the end of the war we met with the former secretary of the party organization of the 94th Border Guard, Detachment Political Officer Kuzenkov. He told us how he had fought his way to his men. "After the battle near Lubny and our meeting at the edge of the forest," said Kuzenkov, "I with 10 wounded border guards went to the medical center of the regiment. However, we did not find the medical station. But we met a group of Lubna women in the forest. Seeing our wounds and our uniforms covered with blood, they took off their handkerchiefs and kerchiefs and bandaged us as best they could. Toward evening we approached a village packed with German troops. Having made sure during the first months of the war that the Germans do not leave the settlements at nightfall, we stealthily went around the village and spent the night in haystacks. To our luck, a group of boys stumbled upon us. I asked them to bring iodine and bandages. The boys quickly carried out this task. We treated each other's wounds and bandaged them properly. In the morning the boys' mothers came and brought food. We had a big breakfast, but there was some left over. Then one of the women took the gas masks out of the gas mask bags and filled them with food. "You can do without these iron boxes," she said, "but food for the road will not be superfluous." "I guess we're all dead now," said another. "They're coming, and you can't beat them." "You're burying us too soon," Mother answered Kuzenkov. "We'll heal up, gather our strength, and we'll get even with the fascists for everything they'll run away from here without a backward glance. Wait, we will definitely come. God willing." The border guards did not dare to stay a day in such a close proximity to the village, which was full of German troops. They said goodbye to the women, and in 3 hours they found themselves in a small forest, where they came upon their own. I was impressed by the location of the border guards, Kuzenkov said. They were lying on the ground as if someone had specially arranged them in rows, head to head, as if on bunks in a model barracks. The sentries were clearly on duty. Watchmen and commanders were awake. Among them I remember well Afanasy Norov. Having consulted, we decided that my group, where all were wounded, would go first. We would mark our route with broken branches, pieces of paper and other signs. The others would follow us. By evening, Kuzenkov's group came to the village and lay down. A motorcyclist rode out of the village along the field road. Border guards stretched a rope across the road, so back in Lubny we hunted German motorcyclists at night, and the unsuspecting Hitler rushing at high speed ended up in a ditch. Then, having oriented themselves by the stars, the group went on. So went on and on, as suddenly they heard dogs barking. With growling dogs rushed at the fighters. Fortunately, most of the border guards had cloaked tents on their shoulders. The dogs grabbed the edge of the tents with their teeth, and the soldiers fought them off with their boots and bayonets. For some reason, the German soldiers, who let the sheepdogs down, did not come close. Apparently they were afraid, but fired from automatic rifles from afar. This duel lasted about an hour, until the border guards broke away from the pursuit. At dawn they entered Popovsky Forest. There they spent the day. From the locals learned that the Germans intended to comb the forest. They hurried to the river. Here they were joined by a senior sergeant aviator and a wounded intendant of the second rank, the head of the topographic department of one of the armies. Kuzenkov's group forced the Coral River successfully. The night was dark. In the area of Alexandrovsky Horse Farm they crossed the railroad, looked into the nearby village. The door was opened by an old man in the last house. There was no one else in the house. The old man sliced bread, put glasses, a jug of milk, and said, "Eat quickly. No matter what time it is. The Germans will look in," and indeed, just when we had time to eat, Hitlerites appeared. We hardly managed to jump out of the house. They settled down in straw stacks, and then German tanks crawled on the road. Suddenly our airplanes appeared. Bombs fell on the column of German troops. The border guards shouted hurrah. The bombs precisely caught up with the targets, and the tanks literally broke apart before their eyes. The fighters were jubilant. At night the group continued its way to the east. They forded some more river and ended up in the village of Savency. Politruk Kuzenkov and intendant of the second rank were taken to General Pleve. He asked them to tell in detail where they were going and what they had seen. And then he thanked for the information, ordered to feed the fighters and provide them with the necessary medical care. I would like to note the exceptional devotion of border guards of our detachment to the motherland, their deep faith in the rightness of our cause and unconditional victory over the enemy. Even being surrounded by enemy troops on the territory temporarily occupied by Hitlerites, soldiers and commanders of the detachment did not hang their heads, kept calm, were confident in the strength of the Soviet people, in its huge capabilities to resist the insolent invaders. Major General Ilyin Mickiewicz, a representative of the Southwestern Front headquarters, gave us the following assessment when leaving the enemy encirclement. I saw many groups and detachments, but this 94th Detachment of Border Guards turned out to be exceptionally organized and fighting. In the Perm regional newspaper Zvezda, October 31st, 1969, was published an article hymn to heroism by APN journalist Alexander Landyshev, which told about the heroism of the 94th Border Guard Detachment, a former border guard of the detachment PV. Mosin responded to the article, "My service at the outpost in the Carpathians was short." The same short was the combat route from the Carpathians to Lubin. After being wounded, I fought in the infantry. Then I was a tanker, paratrooper, scout, and finished the war as an artilleryman in the Far East. 5 times he experienced a hospital bed. Wherever he fought, everywhere there were reliable comrades in arms. But never to forget the battles in the composition of our border guard detachment. The days when a small group of border guards, in which I was, guarded the headquarters of the 26th Army, will always remain in my memory. Together with the Army headquarters, we came out of the encirclement. After several attacks near Orjitsi, we managed to break through a gap through which the headquarters of the 26th Army passed. In this battle, my fellow countrymen border guards Alexei Kazantsev and Vasily Yudin died heroically. Not many people got out of the enemy ring, but the enemy paid dearly. In the summary of the political department of the NKVD troops on the combat activity and political and moral state of the troops to protect the rear of the Southwestern Front, which were in the enemy encirclement in September 1941, it was said, fulfilling the order, no, 270 of the People's Commissar of Defense, the soldiers, commanders and political workers of the units fought hard in the enemy's rear and caused him significant damage. The personnel of the NKVD troops, being surrounded, all the time performed the most responsible tasks. In the fight against superior enemy forces, many soldiers, commanders and political workers showed heroism, courage and bravery. Acting in small groups, border guards bravely made their way forward, inflicting damage to the enemy in manpower and material. Politapparat, party and komsomol organizations of units and subdivisions, being surrounded, were working hard to strengthen the political and moral state, to unite the personnel and mobilize soldiers and commanders to fulfill the task. In the group of political officer Semashko and Captain Tatyanin were created party and komsomol organizations. Continuous party political work was carried out. Battalion Commissars Avdyukin, Ilyin and Leonov, senior political officers Tarakanov, Doroshenko and others with their soldiers bravely and tirelessly fought with the enemy. As a result, each of them took out of the encirclement a group of border guards with weapons and ammunition. Broke through with a group of fighters and regiment commander Major F.I. Vrublevsky. Many years later he wrote, assessing everything that had to endure the soldiers and commanders of the 94th Frontier Troops for the first 90 days of the Great Patriotic War. I think it was a real mass feat of 2,500 people. I was not aware of a single fact of cowardice. None of the border guards voluntarily surrendered to the enemy, did not raise their hands, did not capitulate, no matter how difficult the situation was. Let this feat not be forgotten in the hearts of people.